is Schieber, and welcome to today's K2 UT News. Today we will be talking about the Ebola virus. Ebola is an infectious and general fatal disease marked by fever and severe internal bleeding, spread through contact with infected body fluids by a filovirus, Ebola virus, whose normal host species is unknown. It originally started in West Africa by a single person. This disease spreads very quickly if you think about it. Ebola spreads not just by touching someone. Think of it like this. If I had a cut on my hand and someone else had a cut on their hand and we both shook hands and my blood got into their system, then they would have Ebola. The World Health Organization states that you do not become contagious until you are showing the symptoms of Ebola. Ebola originally started in West Africa by a single person, like I said earlier. Now, Ebola has spread to Madrid, Skopje, Cairns, and most recently, Dallas, Texas. There is also a potential case in Nebraska, but we have got the majority of it under control. There have been many more countries and cities affected by Ebola, but those are the most recent cases. Now, one of the more recent cases is that Ebola has spread to the United States. It started in Dallas, Texas by a man named Scott Farrell, who passed away from the disease recently. More recently, it has spread up north, where someone who traveled to West Africa called a nearby hospital in Kansas, thinking he had Ebola. After waiting a couple days for the test results to come back, we figured out that he did not have Ebola. Now you might be wondering how nurses and doctors can treat Ebola patients without actually getting Ebola. Nurses and doctors treat Ebola patients by covering every inch of their skin with material that the Ebola disease cannot get through. Now, if you're probably wondering why Ebola is so bad, let me explain. Ebola is deadly. It only takes weeks for it to kill a person. Other ways countries are trying to keep Ebola out is by quarantine. They put a possible Ebola patient under quarantine and run tests on the person under quarantine. Hospitals and airports are also trying to keep Ebola out by having a special video camera or monitor that watches out for any passing person who might have come in from any outside country in nearby Africa. They also have signs asking you if you have gone to Africa in the past 6 months to go see a worker. If you have been to Africa in the past 6 months, you have to get a checkup by a doctor and make sure you're okay to board the plane. We are switching the subject to why Ebola has started and when. People believe that Ebola started when a 2-year-old boy ate food that a bat had spit on with Ebola and caused the disease. He died later that month. While he had the disease, his mother, sister, and grandmother all caught it. They all died later that month also. The Africans who buried the little family knew very little about the disease, which probably explains why few of them caught it at the grandmother's funeral. This just goes to show how fast Ebola can really spread.
When it comes to Ebola, the first thing you need to know is that dying from the virus is like something out of a horror movie. It's extremely painful and terrifying. First you get a fever, then uncontrollable diarrhea, then you begin hemorrhaging blood. And while all that's hitting you, you lose touch with reality and become delirious. Finally, within days, you are dead. West Africa is currently in the midst of by far the worst case of the disease since it was first discovered in Africa back in 1976. This year's outbreak has been traced to a 2-year-old boy who died on December 6, 2013 in a village in Guinea. He probably got the virus by eating contaminated food that had been drooled or defecated on by a bat, or, as is common in this part of the world, had eaten some bat for dinner. Bats, researchers believe, are the carriers of the disease. As if the 2-year-old's death wasn't tragic enough, a week after it killed him, it killed his mother, his 3-year-old sister, and then his grandmother. Now, it's customary in some African villages to prepare a body for burial through the extremely sanitary cleansing ritual that involves evacuating the body of all food and excreta, often using just bare hands. Since the disease is spread by bodily fluids getting into the eyes, nose, or mouth, it's no surprise that two people who traveled to the grandmother's funeral caught Ebola and brought it home to their villages. After escaping Ground Zero, the highly contagious, undetected virus was off to the races. By the end of March, Ebola had reached Liberia, and in June, the first case was reported in Monrovia, Liberia's capital city. That's when outbreaks like this really start to spread, when the infected people make their way to population centers during the incubation phase, before their symptoms begin. A group of people from Sierra Leone who had traveled to an Ebola victim's funeral brought the disease back across the border, and in late July the virus had hit Sierra Leone's capital, Freetown. Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone are 3 of the 17 nations that form the Economic Community of West African States, whose combined territory is roughly half the land area of the United States, but with a population roughly the same at 340 million, it's about twice as dense as America. And since the disease is easily passed from person to person, and there are lots of people here, it's crucial to get outbreaks like this under control as quickly as possible, especially since a staggering 47%, or 2,984 of the just over 6,400 people who have been sickened by this strain of Ebola have died. So understandably, this is terrifying to neighboring countries, who have responded by shutting down their borders. Still, Nigeria, the largest country in Africa by population and economic output, couldn't keep the disease beyond its borders when an infected Liberian-American man named Patrick Sawyer flew into Nigeria's largest city and died shortly thereafter. A Nigerian doctor named Stella Ameyo Adedeva stopped Sawyer from leaving the hospital, stopping the spread of Ebola to the 21 million people living in Lagos.
We know that Ebola has started earlier in the year, but did you know that this disease originally was discovered in 1976? But my sources from Google say that there have been more cases and deaths in this outbreak than all others combined. Now, if you ask me, this disease seems like it's getting to its worst point. The 1976 virus had 280 deaths and 38 confirmed survivors. But as you can clearly tell, the Ebola virus of 2014 is almost 10 times worse than the 1976 outbreak. Here are 5 fun facts to know about the Ebola virus. Ebola kills up to 90% of its victims. More than 2,000 people have been infected with Ebola, including healthcare workers. This disease is not being spread by animals, only by people. The World Health Organization says it may infect as many as 20,000 people before it's stopped. Some scientists are testing to see if Ebola can spread to us from monkeys and/or bats. Breaking news. As of yesterday, the CDC says that the United States is officially Ebola-free. Some other Ebola cases you might find interesting are in Zaire, where 318 people got infected with the disease, but 280 of them died. That's about 88% of the people that got infected that died. Another example was in Sudan in 1974, where 284 people became infected with this horrible disease and 156 of them died. That was about 55% of the people that died. Now it is time for some questions and opinions on the subject. Do you think Ebola will ever spread all over the country? I do think the spread of Ebola could possibly come back from West Africa, and it could come back in the very near future, but we'd never know. Do you have the fear that you'll ever get Ebola if it does come back? I honestly have never had the fear of Ebola affecting me, and I honestly never have thought of it coming toward me because it's never happened in Kansas, even though there have been some potential cases, but I have no fear about it affecting me. Last question. What is your opinion on the subject? My opinion would be that Ebola is a really bad disease, and the people who get it are, well, I wouldn't say unlucky, it just happens like any other disease that you can get. But we do have very smart scientists and doctors working to find a cure, and I'm glad, I guess, that it's out of the United States. And now it's time for an interview with a healthcare worker who actually worked in Africa for about a month. Are you preparing for Ebola?
Oh, absolutely. Um, what we have to do is make sure that anybody that comes to the hospital that might have symptoms of Ebola and who have traveled to where Ebola is known to be, that we make sure that we immediately put them in isolation. And with that means that we have to teach staff how to recognize somebody that might be with Ebola, but then how to protect themselves when we do identify that there's somebody that potentially would have Ebola.
Have you had any patients with Ebola?
We've not had any at the hospital with Ebola, but we did have a patient one time that had traveled from West Africa, and so we immediately put them in isolation to make sure that everybody was safe until we realized that they did not have Ebola.
What do you think about the Ebola disease?
Do you want me to answer what do I think about it, or what is it?
What do you think about it?
I think that it's a very scary disease because there are so many people that have died in Africa. But I think that in Africa it's very different than here in the United States. In Africa they don't have health care like we have here in the United States.
Thank you, Tom. And something you might not have known about Tom is that he actually worked in West Africa for a little bit, teaching healthcare workers about the Ebola disease and how to treat it. So that was really interesting to interview. Well, that about rounds up our KTUT news. I'm Emma Schieber, and thank you for watching today.